This is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories this hour. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi calls for in-depth dialogue to stabilise ties during talks with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The Israeli military conducts more air and ground raids in Gaza as the UN says the Palestinian enclave is being strangled by a lack of aid. 6 people are injured in Egypt after projectiles hit 2 Red Sea towns, raising fears of a spillover from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And European leaders discuss how to support Ukraine after struggling to find common ground on Gaza. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China and the United States need in-depth and wide-ranging talks to get their relationship back on track. Wang made the comment during a meeting with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Washington. The top diplomat is on a 3-day visit aimed at working through differences to rebuild ties between the two countries. CGTN's Jim Spellman is in Washington, D.C. Good to see you again, Jim. So what have the two diplomats discussed so far?
Yeah, well, these discussions are continuing. They're back at it for the second day right now. Foreign Minister Wang Yi meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken here at the State Department. They also met yesterday evening, first for one-on-one meetings, and then for a working dinner. In comments before those meetings on Thursday, Wang Yi said that increased communication will be key to improving this relationship. Listen.
China and the United States need to have dialogue. Not only should we resume dialogue, but dialogue should be comprehensive so that with dialogue we have increased understanding, reduced misunderstanding, constantly seek to expand common ground and pursue cooperation that will benefit both sides, so that we can stabilize China-US relations and return it to the track of healthy, stable and sustainable development.
Wang Yi acknowledged that there will be differences of opinion in this relationship, stressing all the more reason to have clear, open communication lines to resolve those differences. In response to those comments, Tony Blinken simply said he agreed with the foreign minister while they were meeting. Antony Blinken also expressed condolences, over the passing of former Premier Li Keqiang. Back to you.
And Jim, it is quite a packed day for Wang Yi ahead. What's he got in store?
Yeah, so once they wrap up here at the State Department, Wang Yi will meet with the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. That meeting likely to take place at the White House. It's also possible that he will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden. That's been widely speculated that that will happen here today, perhaps as part of laying the groundwork for a potential meeting next month between Joe Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping at APEC in San Francisco. None of that's been confirmed, but those are definitely some goals for foreign policy hands here in Washington. Now, when meeting with the National Security Advisor, the foreign minister is going to hear a U.S. desire for help from China to keep the war that's currently happening in Israel and Gaza from expanding into a larger regional conflict. An acknowledgement here that China simply has more credibility with Arab states and perhaps in Tehran than the United States has at the moment. The National Security Advisor also letting us know that he would be bringing up difficult issues, including the South China Sea. I think, though, that the overall theme for this meeting is going to be enhancing communications, and a key thing for that will be enhancing military-to-military communication. That's another topic on the agenda today. Back to you, Juliet.
Jim Spellman in Washington, D.C., thank you very much. The UN says Palestinian refugees in Gaza feel shunned, alienated and abandoned as humanitarian aid slowly trickles into the enclave. Overnight, Israel conducted more targeted raids, striking dozens of Hamas targets and killing another senior commander of the Palestinian armed group. At least 7,300 people have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October, according to Gaza's health ministry. That's when Hamas launched those unprecedented, horrific attacks on Israel, killing more than 1,400 people and taking 229 hostages.
Unprecedented humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip. We have been here since 1967 in the occupied territories and Israel. We have never witnessed this large-scale deterioration in the humanitarian sector, considering the 3-week period of this conflict. Fuel is essential to not only to keep the hospitals and healthcare centers operational. Fuel is required also to run bakeries, to run water and wastewater pump stations that if they stop, we will witness also an environmental crisis at a population level.
The UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees says at least 1 million people in Gaza were forced to flee their homes in just 1 week. The exodus came in response to an Israeli order for people to evacuate from northern Gaza to the south, but hundreds of thousands of Palestinian families have refused. Our correspondent in Gaza, Noor Harazin, reports.
Fuad Ayyad is a Palestinian Christian from Gaza. His home was destroyed by Israeli airstrikes on the southern Al-Rimal neighborhood, forcing him to evacuate to his church, St. Pervilius in central Gaza City. The church has also come under attack, and it's located in an area under Israeli evacuation orders, but Ayyad refuses to flee south.
There are no safe places, whether mosques, churches, or hospitals. Wherever you go or look, you find destruction. My family and I were not displaced because I didn't find a safe place to go. Last night was a dark night. Me and my family didn't sleep. I'm afraid for my daughter, not myself. I want a safe place for my daughter and my wife.
The Al-Shifa hospital complex has become a refugee camp for thousands of Palestinian families. They have brought mattresses, blankets, and pillows, taking shelter in what they believe is the safest place in Gaza. Rahim Dahir uses his car as a storage and a kitchen for the supplies he managed to take with him when evacuating. Dahir and his 20 family members have taken shelter in the street, oppose the Al-Shifa hospital.
We've turned into beggars. We are running after the water truck to fill up on water to drink. This is not life. Where will we go in the south? We have no relatives there, so we prefer to stay here so we can find people to help us if we need to borrow money to buy food. Everyone in the south is no better off than us anyway.
The Gaza Strip is home to 2.3 million people, living in an area covering 365 square kilometers. The scale of the Israeli strikes on Gaza has made it unsafe to live in, no matter where people flee to. Noor Harazin, CGTN, Gaza.
Well, meanwhile, projectiles hit 2 Egyptian Red Sea towns, injuring 6 people and raising fears of a spillover from the Israel-Palestine conflict. Let's talk to our correspondent Yasser Hakim in Egypt's Al Arish. Yasser, what do we know about these blasts in Egypt?
Well, the first one took place early in the morning on Taba. Taba is the city on the borders, small city, it's 1 kilometer on the border with Israel. And it hit a hospital, administrative building next to a hospital, and it injured 6 people there. The government or the military actually had held an investigation and said that it was a drone that has dropped there and caused this explosion, and that the 6 injured have left hospital safe. Then there was another one in Nuweiba nearby, a few kilometers nearby, but still we don't know any information about it, and nothing has been announced on what it is and how both of them have come to Egypt, from which location. Israel says it could be Hamas targeting Eilat, an Israeli city on the border with Egypt, and has come mistakenly hit Egypt. So still more information is needed about it. What we have is more questions than answers. Back to you.
Well, yes, so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about these aid trucks that are expected to be entering Gaza through Egypt's Rafah border. What can you tell us?
Yes, the border is a few kilometers away from where I am now, and today there were 10 trucks that have entered to Gaza, making a total of about 100 trucks now. They've hit the 100 mark, but 100 mark in 5 or 6 days, it means an average of 15 to 20 a day. This is way, way below what the UN needs. It says that we need at least 100 trucks per day of aid. And for the first time, 10 doctors have entered Gaza from the Rafah border, and they are Red Cross doctors, all from Europe. We don't know the nationalities, but they're European, with medical equipment, and they will be with the mission to have or to conduct surgeries, emergency surgeries, in several hospitals or shelters run by the UN agencies in Gaza. So those 10 doctors will be having a mission there, and we're waiting for any news of a quicker rate of aid to go into Rafah, from Rafah into Gaza in the next few days, as the UN has requested. Back to you.
Yasser Hakim in Al Ahrish, thank you very much. Well, in a moment, we'll head to our reporter in Tel Aviv for the latest there. But first, let's speak to Danny Ayalon in Jerusalem. He's a former Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel and former ambassador to the United States. Thank you for coming on the programme, Your Excellency. Now, there have been more targeted raids by Israel overnight. How might that and the death of a senior Hamas commander change Israel's campaign?
Well, it seems like that the only deterrence they have is they fear for their lives. You know, they are recruiting many suicide bombers and sending them for death, but they pretty much take care of themselves. So by targeting them, not only is bringing justice to them because they're murderous people, but also it's a deterrence. It's a very complex matter, and it takes time.
It is a complex matter, and I know you say you are targeting them, the terrorists, but there have been an enormous amount of casualties from Israeli airstrikes. The UN says aid getting through isn't enough and that people in Gaza feel alienated and abandoned. What do you think civilians there should do?
Well, they should just leave the area. What Israel has done for the last few days is urging them, actually the people of Gaza, to leave all the positions of Hamas. You see that Hamas, ISIS, is perpetrating double war crime because they're targeting our civilians and they're using their own civilians as human shields. So what we're trying to do is separate them. And we have prepared with the international community a safe area for them in the southern part of Gaza. The idea is that they leave to the southern Gaza of Gaza. By the way, just like our own population, you know, in the south is living to the north side. So they are also out of harm's way. So then we can really reach Hamas without fear of hurting civilians.
There have been calls for a pause in fighting to allow aid to reach civilians. Why is Israel opposed to that?
Simply because the aid is being robbed and looted by Hamas, and they're using it for their quote-unquote war efforts. For instance, the UNRWA itself, the UN agency, reported, and they put it on Twitter, that the gasoline for their own purposes was actually taken and stolen by Hamas. So what we're saying is that it has to be kind of a system of verification where everything that goes into Gaza goes to the population and not to Hamas.
As we've reported, more than 1,400 people were brutally killed in Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October. 229 are still being held hostage. We are hearing reports, though, that there's been progress on Qatar-mediated talks on hostage release and ceasefire. So what information do you have on the hostage situation?
Well, in 10 stop, the only one that has some leverage over Hamas is the government of Qatar. The government of Qatar gave them billions of dollars. And again, it was misused. The billions of dollars that Qatar gave Hamas was to rebuild Gaza for their own population. But of course, they built it, their military apparatus, you know, underneath, you know, all the bunkers and command and control centers. The idea here now is to have a total exchange of prisoners. If Hamas is willing to let all the hostages out, and most of them are civilians, 85-year-old ladies and babies, if they're out, Israel will be willing to release all the Hamas prisoners. There are quite a few thousands of them. I think that would be a fair deal The question is, will Hamas take it?
Can you give us an idea of the timeline of that? We're hearing that it might be happening soon. Are we talking hours? Are we talking days? And how might the release of some hostages then affect Israel's decision-making process in this conflict?
Well, I'm afraid it's going to be days more than hours. I wish it would be hours, but there are intense talks, especially between Doha and Qatar and the Hamas people. If all the hostages are released, it certainly will clear the way for the IDF to go and mop up the bunkers of Hamas, just like the Allied forces in 1945 mopped up the bunkers of Hitler and Nazis.
Danny Ayalon, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your insights.
Pleasure.
We'll be getting the Palestinian view in the next hour, when we'll be speaking to Yazid Sa'i, a Palestinian historian, academic and former advisor. But let's speak to our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Sarah Coates. Good to see you, Sarah. Now, several people have been injured in a rocket attack there. Tell me more.
Yeah, look, Juliet, they certainly have. The last few hours right here in Tel Aviv have been extremely tense. A number of barrages of rockets coming over from the Gaza Strip. And let me tell you, they were loud. It's probably the biggest day of rockets on the ground since I've been here. I've been here for around 20 or so days now. Interceptions right above me here. All of the glass behind me, including in those buildings there behind me, was shaking. Now, we can tell you that a number of people are being treated by the Israeli paramedics after a direct hit on a house in Tel Aviv. You can see these images of a big fireball coming out the side of this house with smoke rising up into the sky, while a lower level of this apartment building was also hit. Now, in a second barrage, we know that a rocket, which wasn't intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defence system, it hit a park. And look, it's a real wonder no one wasn't injured in that. As you can see, it's a beautiful day behind me. It's around 30 degrees. And given Friday, which is the first day of the weekend here in Tel Aviv, it is normally so busy. Families out and about, going to the beach there behind me, walking along the promenade. But look, since all of this kicked off on the 7th of October, Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel, of course, have really become ghost towns. Now, just very briefly, we did hear the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant. He came out to address Israeli and foreign media just a matter of minutes ago, speaking about this potential ground incursion that we've heard so much about. He says it will be long and difficult and will require what he says is a vast network of tunnels used by Hamas to be absolutely taken out. He's also saying that Hamas's main operations are based under the Shifa hospital in Gaza City. So look, as Danny Ayalon came on just before me to say, it certainly seems as though this will happen, potentially not in the next couple of days, but Israeli Defence Forces say it will happen.
They say it will happen, and yet we are hearing, Sarah, that there's been progress on negotiations for a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas. We were talking to Danny Ayalon about that, so what more can you tell us?
Well, certainly, look, sources close to Hamas are reporting that significant progress is being made to secure the release of these hostages. Israel Defence Forces has updated this number. 229 people are now being held in the Gaza Strip, held captive there by Hamas. They say there is progress on these negotiations, although issues still remain, but they are hopeful of achieving something substantial very, very soon. And look, let me tell you, this would be such a relief to these families. Here in Tel Aviv, there have been protests day after day with people gathering, bringing things like teddy bears and setting up Shabbat tables, which will happen tonight once again, pleading with the Israeli government to do whatever it can to bring these people home, also saying that they want a ceasefire, saying instead of this fighting, they just want their loved ones home.
Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv, thank you very much. The United Nations is due to meet later to vote on proposals for a ceasefire in the Israel conflict. In a second day of talks on the crisis at the UN, Jordan has sponsored a resolution that also calls for unhindered humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. Well, CG Chen's Yola Abdavid joins us for more on this. Yola, the Security Council haven't reached an agreement over this. Talk Talk us through the full UN proposals and what Jordan is sponsoring here.
There's tortuous debates and quite volatile statements being made in the United Nations. You're right, the Security Council didn't actually agree on 2 resolutions. They were binned, they were blocked, if you like, in terms of the vote within the Security Council. 5 permanent members, and actually 3 of them, China, Russia and the United States, have blocked the resolutions so far. Now it's gone from the Security Council to the main General Assembly. 193 nations are a member of that. So you could argue that it is an open discussion and a debate, and it might lead to a vote. It's not potentially legally binding in the way that a Security Council resolution is. That's a big difference in terms of what's being talked about. But yes, there is a new draft resolution. It will be updated, but it's likely to be divisive again because it does not mention Hamas by name. And this is one of the reasons why the European countries, United States, Canada, as well as Israel, of course, would find it unpalatable to back any resolution that doesn't point the finger at Hamas in terms of what happened on the 7th of October, in terms of the 1,400 Israelis that were killed. Now, the focus has been, ever since the 7th or the 8th of October, has been on Gaza itself. The airstrikes, the mounting casualties in terms of deaths in Gaza, which of course has infuriated and shocked many, many people around the world. So the debate yesterday was quite fractious. And you had the Palestinians, who doesn't actually have a vote, but their representatives said that, you know, we are speaking here while families are being killed, hospitals are becoming to a halt, neighborhoods are being destroyed. Now, you say this is sponsored by Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, of the Arab nations, and we had the foreign minister from Jordan, Ayman Safadi, saying that this is a trauma that will haunt generations of people. And then the Israelis, of course, were countering that and saying that this resolution claims to be concerned about peace, and yet the depraved murderers who initiated the war, according to the Israeli ambassador, is not even being talked about. It's going to be a difficult second day in the General Assembly. Lots
of strong language there. David, thank you very much. European Union leaders are discussing their continuing support for Ukraine and how to fund it on the second day of a summit in Brussels. Migration's also on the agenda. After hours of reportedly tense talks on Thursday, in the early hours of the morning, the presidents of the European Commission and Council announced an agreement on Gaza. Avoiding a call for a ceasefire, the leaders said there need to be pauses to allow the movement of humanitarian aid. Our correspondent Julia Chapman joins us now from Brussels. Julia, what has changed when it comes to the EU and Ukraine?
Well, certainly there are dissenting voices in the form of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. That's nothing new, but there is now a new administration in Slovakia with the new Prime Minister Robert Fico here attending his first European Council meeting since taking power, and he wanted to emphasize concerns about corruption in Ukraine when it comes to EU funding. Orban talked about a big battle that was had between leaders on Thursday when discussing the wording on Ukraine, but ultimately neither of them blocked the language that was used in the final text, which condemned what leaders called Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and vowing to continue supporting Ukraine with military aid. There was also a reference in that text to increasing the proposals and putting more pressure, accelerating proposals on using the revenues from frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine rebuild. Those proposals are still in the relatively early stages, but a big emphasis on that as well. Ultimately, though, there was broad unity when it came to the position on Ukraine, although there will be challenges ahead when it comes to getting the next budget through in December.
Well, Julia, you talk about that broad unity, but it took the leaders a long time on Thursday to reach an agreed wording on Gaza. How deep are the disagreements there?
much more discord when it comes to the complex situation between Israel and Gaza. There are some leaders who wanted to call for a ceasefire, others who were much more reticent, instead preferring to focus on their belief that Israel has a right to defend itself. But ultimately, all leaders did agree on the need for humanitarian aid to reach Gaza, if not on the method of that happening. But the wording did take some time to agree on. Ultimately, what they came to was a call for humanitarian pauses and corridors. So certainly there are questions about whether Israel will abide by that language. Will it see any pressure from that wording? But EU officials insistent that that will make a difference when it comes to getting aid into Gaza for those who need it.
Julia Chapman in Brussels, thank you very much. Armenia's Prime Minister has met his Azerbaijani counterpart in the first meeting of its kind since the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Nikol Pashinyan and Azerbaijan's Ali Asadov were both shown attending a dinner hosted by Georgia's Prime Minister in Tbilisi on the second day of the Regional Silk Road Forum. On Thursday, Pashinyan indicated that a peace deal with Baku may be on the way, saying an agreement on the establishment of relationships with its neighbour could come within months. At least 27 people are dead after the strongest storm ever to hit Mexico's west coast roared ashore, packing winds of 265 kilometers per hour. Hurricane Otis slammed into the resort city of Acapulco, flooding streets and ripping roofs off homes and hotels. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
This is Acapulco, a town on Mexico's Pacific coast devastated by Otis, a Category 5 hurricane which struck this town on Wednesday, destroying homes, hotels and vehicles and leaving it without electricity, cell phone service, water and other basic services. Hurricane Otis was a Category 5 storm, and just to give you an idea of what that means, that is the strongest possible category of hurricane that there is, and you can see here the strength of it. You can see here behind me the McDonald's golden arches have been completely doubled over, as well as trees all along this main drag have been uprooted and thrown into the air and landed, as you can see here. And that is just how devastating, how strong these 270 kilometre-hour winds, rain and hail, which pummeled Acapulco. As we drove into town last night, the streets were flooded, but nevertheless we saw families, individuals carrying their belongings away through the water on their backs in shopping carts, however they could, as they sought to reach higher ground and away from areas which continue to present dangers. Acapulco is a beach resort whose economy depends almost entirely on tourism, but the seafront and the devastation following this Category 5 hurricane has devastated touristic infrastructure. This was a famous taco restaurant here, but as you can see, it's been completely demolished by this Category 5 hurricane, and this is going to represent serious economic problems in the medium to long term as Acapulco tries to recover and works out how to welcome tourists back. Here by the Pacific Ocean, on the famous Acapulco Bay, helicopters are flying overhead as the authorities attempt still to get a reading on the total amount of damage following Hurricane Otis. But from here onwards, it's going to be a long path to recovery for Acapulco. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Acapulco, Mexico.
The headlines again. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi calls for in-depth dialogue to stabilize ties during talks with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The Israeli military conducts more air and ground raids in Gaza as the UN says the Palestinian enclave is being strangled by a lack of aid. And European leaders discuss how to support Ukraine after struggling to find common ground on Gaza. And that's The World Today. Thanks for watching. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, though, from all the team here in London, goodbye.